Everybody, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, we thank you so much. If you're listening to us on the YouTube, please like, subscribe, or share this interview. It's Daniel Levin back here on the program. We love having him on because he has so much knowledge of foreign affairs in general. And he did write the book, Proof of Life. Definitely check it out on bookstores if you can get there. If you can't, go to his website, which is DanielLevineAuthor.com. Again, DanielLevineAuthor.com. So Daniel, always a pleasure. Love having you on.
Thanks. Pleasure to be with you, Rob.
All right, so let's kick it around. So Biden's almost a year in, pretty much. Can you speak on what your opinion is on his foreign policy so far?
I think, you and I spoke about this in the past. I think that his focus, first of all, is primarily domestic policy. He's trying to get all his various infrastructure bills and Build Back Better bills passed, the spending bills passed, and he's dealing with a situation that he almost can't win. You got a 50-50 Senate. He's got Joe Manchin today saying that he's going to vote against it. And so the obsession in the U.S. is really about that. You got midterms coming up. That's part of the problem with the U.S. is that you have constantly election mode. And so you can't actually formulate a coherent foreign policy because you can't do foreign policy year to year. And every year someone's campaigning for something. Every 2 years it's the full House. Every 2 years is a third of the Senate. Every 4 years it's the president. And so you can't really have anything coherent. I think Biden's almost exclusive foreign focus of his administration, as Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, has been China. And if you ask me to give a grade, I'd give an F.
Yeah.
Just because the focus on China has been so silly in the sense that there's a lot of grandstanding coming, talking about human rights and Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And every time you give some important press conference saying how bad you think the Chinese are, you've just reduced your chances of coming to agreements with the Chinese on things that actually do matter. I'll give you an example. We've obviously been talking about Iran, right?
Yeah.
And about the nuclear agreement and about everyone's trying to get back to Vienna to go and get back on the nuclear agreement. We can talk about that for days in a row. One of the key players, probably the key player, if you wanted to have any influence over the Iranian regime, is China. Why? Not for military reasons. Actually, there's really not a military solution. The U.S. is not going to start a war with Iran. That's not going to happen. Israel can't solve the nuclear escalation in Iran on its own. It's not possible. Every serious Israeli general will confirm that to you, right? I'm not talking about the politicians. I'm talking the general. So the only way you actually get the Iranians to climb down from the tree that they're on in terms of nuclear proliferation is through economic pressure. China holds more Iranian currency as receivables than the Iranian central bank. That means China can control the degree of inflation that you have in Iran. In other words, if China releases their local currency holdings in a big bang, you have hyperinflation. If they agree to hold on to it, the Iranians can avoid inflation. Inflation is what's going to topple that regime if it happens, meaning that a person wakes up in the morning and can buy himself a loaf of bread, but that same amount of money at the end of the day can't buy that loaf of bread anymore, right? That's what inflation actually means. And so the only ones who really hold a key with real leverage, economic leverage against the Iranians is not the US sanctions, not UN sanctions, not Western Europe, it's not the Israelis, it's really the Chinese. So going back to your original question, which is what do I think of foreign policy? I'm fine if you want to focus on China, but can we just focus on China in terms of getting done together with China what we believe are the biggest challenges, whether it's pandemic response, whether it's Iran, whether it's nuclear escalation, other places, North Korea and so on? Or are we going to just keep on holding press conferences telling the world that we think the Chinese are not democratic and that they're controlling Hong Kong and that they're mistreating the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? May all be true, but where exactly is the U.S. interest there?
Yeah, but they can use that same argument against the U.S. We go back to what happened with the Indians and the Native Americans as far as what's going on with the Uyghurs. The Japanese after World War II, when FDR put them in the internment camps. So they can just play back and forth with those arguments, and we're never going to win.
There is no superpower in the history of the world that became a superpower by being beautiful and ethical and empathetic with the people who lost all the power the same. It just doesn't exist. You can go whether you're looking at the Greeks or the Roman empires or the German Empire. It doesn't really matter which one, all the way to the US empire. I mean, the America's economic miracle had a lot to do with the fact that they have hundreds of years of free labor through slavery, right? So let's not, I think the idea of walking around and basing your foreign policy on some cheap, moralistic press conferences is not a really good way to do it. The better way to do it is to look at China. You don't have to like everything about China, but you have to make two lists. Which means one list is where can our interests and China's interests be aligned? And wherever they can be aligned, that's where we work together. And wherever they cannot be aligned, for whatever reason, South China Sea, Taiwan, friendship treaty with Japan, whatever, currency, meaning currency and the current account deficit, right? Trade deficit with China, whatever the case may be, you isolate those points, because in order to deal with global challenges, from pandemic to climate change to Iran, whatever you perceive to be global challenges, we have two superpowers in the world today. That's the US and China. That's our reality. No one asks you or me whether we like it or not. That's just the reality. And if those two can synchronize that, then you're going to get mutually assured destruction. And I don't think that helps either the Chinese people or the American people. So if you're asking me about foreign policy, the US hasn't had a coherent foreign policy probably since Nixon had it on China.
Mm-hmm. Right. I want to keep going into the Iran nuclear deal. We saw in the New York Times, Israel is pushing the White House to demand more in these talks with Iran without confronting Biden. You know, my thing, and I want you to expand on that, but my thing that I'm worried about is, you know, we saw the relationship, and obviously Netanyahu is not there anymore. We saw that relationship with Obama and how it was, you know, Bibi kind of made him look silly when he came over to the U.S. House and made a speech there when Obama didn't want him there. Then there was a good relationship between Trump and Bibi, and now I don't know, and you can expand on this, of how the relationship is with Bennett and Biden now, because I just was researched before we came on the air that Israel imported from January to November, the imports from China are up 40%. So that concerns me, as all the tension that we are provoking China with, that if Israel even allies more towards China than the U.S., it's going to be a real big problem down the road for the U.S.
So there's a lot to unpack here. Okay, that's one is U.S. Israel, and then you have U.S. China, Israel China. Let's step back a few steps. First of all, obviously, without a doubt, today the U.S. is Israel's most important relationship. Nothing comes even close. And I can tell you, just to start at the end of this, when China makes investments into Israel and its technology sector, there is an equivalent that you have in the U.S. In the U.S., you have a committee called CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. It's an interagency committee that determines whether certain foreign countries can make investments in certain key U.S. industries, defense, technology, cybersecurity, right? Where you're trying to keep foreign money out because you have to make sure that U.S. interests and U.S. safety come first. Israel has the same thing. So there have been Chinese requests to invest in military high-tech, weaponized artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotechnology, and Israeli ports, where those investment requests have been denied because they've been contrary to U.S. national security, to Israeli national security interests, where it would not be denied and hasn't been denied if those requests come from the U.S. So very clearly, Israel views the U.S. not only as its most important ally, but also as its lifeline and its security lifeline. And that's number one. There's a lot of new open doors being established between Israel and China on commercial side, on trade, but nothing comes close to them. And it's a matter of proportion that we can't even compare. Now, Israel would make a terrible mistake to take the American relationship for granted. Let's go back not that long ago. In the 1950s, right? First of all, Israel was created in 1948, not with U.S. support. Obviously, in the end, the U.S. was fine with it, but it was really European powers, primarily Britain and France, that supported the UN resolution in 1948, the partition resolution. Then you have the 50s, when escalation between Israel and Egypt. At the time, the president of Egypt was Nasser, over the Suez Canal. The French and the British thought they could get around the Americans and align with Israel against Egypt and take out Nasser, right, for their own interests. And the US put a stop to that and explained to everyone involved, France, UK, and Israel, don't you ever be on the other side of us. You do not act against our interests. Why am I saying that? It would be a terrible mistake for Israel to think that as strong as its relationship is the US, that nothing could ever happen for that to change. Do not take that for granted. What Bibi did when he came and spoke to Congress against Obama, it's not a matter of whether he's entitled to his opinion or not. I actually thought his views were stupid because he was actually advocating against the Iranian nuclear deal when his entire intelligence establishment was saying this is a good deal. It's not that it's a good deal in itself. Your options are this deal or no deal, and this deal is better than no deal. His entire military intelligence establishment was saying it. Bibi was also the one who advocated for Bush to take out Saddam, if you remember, right? Now, if you think that the Iranians are really the biggest threat to Israel, why do you take out the Iraqi leader who's the only natural enemy the Iranians actually have? So let's not even get into the substance of it, but you are an Israeli prime minister. You travel to the US and you talk against a sitting US president. I don't care if that's a Democrat or Republican. No American should take that. And the fact that the Republicans in Congress instigated that and stood up and applauded says something about our own country and how tribal and divided we are. That's the truth. Can you even imagine something like that happening 30, 40 years ago? Any foreign leader comes and talks against an American president, that doesn't happen. So that's a story in itself. The fact that Bibi did that for his own domestic consumption was a nightmare. Now, there was certainly the 4 years with Trump. That looks like those guys aren't about to have drinks together anytime soon. First of all, because Trump doesn't drink, but second of all, because Trump obviously felt that when Bibi congratulated Biden, even though Bibi waited a long time, that was a betrayal, and so on, right? And he had his famous, you know what, bleep Bibi, obviously, in his interview that he recently gave. Now, when it comes to Biden, I think it's a little more complicated. Biden certainly believes that settlement expansions are something of the past. I also think that America has to start rethinking what its strategy should be for the Middle East when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians. Because the old talk of a two-state solution, and you evacuate the settlements, and you find out something that Ehud Barak proposed to Arafat in the late 90s, 97% of the territories plus half of Jerusalem, and Arafat said no. That ended it for Israel. That's not going to happen. That's not happening in our lifetime. And we had, now we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands more Jewish settlers in the West Bank. That's not going to get evacuated. Now the question is there a one-state solution? Can you have a binational state? Is that something that can happen? Is that realistic? U.S. foreign policy establishment has to start rethinking how it wants to talk about Israel and the Palestinians, if it even wants to talk about it. Because the alternative is, of course, to say, let's stop talking about the Palestinians. We'll deal with Jordan. We'll deal with water rights in Jordan. We'll deal with Syria, with Lebanon, with Egypt in the Middle East. But we'll also focus on Israeli relationships with Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Kuwait, with Oman, right? There are other relationships that are relevant. And the Palestinians at some point have to figure out whether they want to join that process or not. Now, that's not about whether they lost everything in 1948. It's not what happened in 1967 with the occupation of the territory. It's not a political statement. It's just a reality. We're in 2021, about to be in 2022. And those debates and the two-state solution discussion and the evacuations and territorial swaps are politically no longer relevant. And one last thing on that, Rob. In fact, if you wanted to have a two-state solution, you could do it quite easily, because the overwhelming majority of Jewish settlers live very close to the so-called Green Line, meaning the line, the pre-1967 line, meaning the settlements that are remote outposts in the occupied territories, or Judea and Samaria, if you're a conservative or right-wing Israeli, they're very sparsely populated. So in fact, you wouldn't have to displace large populations to create a two-state solution. It's simply that politically that's not feasible. And if you look at the demographics in Israel and the Palestinian population, the population segments that are growing by far the fastest, the religious, most radical ones, are the ones who least want a two-state solution. So American foreign policy has to stop talking about this as if we're talking about the 1980s or 1990s. We're no longer in that world in the Middle East.
And again, for people that are listening, this is Daniel Levin. The book is Proof of Life. Definitely check it out in bookstores now. Trump came out on a podcast and said, and maybe you know where I'm going here, Daniel, but he said that evangelicals love Israel more than Jews. Can you give us a little talking point on what your take is on that?
Well, he obviously is realizing that the majority of American Jews are progressive and vote Democratic, right?
Right.
And so that's obviously that's the old trope that's saying that Jews that don't support Israel, no matter what the policies are self-hating Jews. And evangelicals have a completely different perspective on Israel, which is it's the promised land. It all fits into Armageddon. It fits a narrative into redemption, and therefore they don't question that belief because it's a God-commanded kind of process there, right? How you embrace Jews, and by the way, that last moment of conversion. So I don't even want to get into evangelical gospel here, but my point about that is I don't like those kinds of statements. I really don't. You know, you can be very critical of Israeli policy. My dad was a war hero in the War of Independence. I served in the Israeli army and special forces. I don't need anyone to tell me whether I'm a good Jew or not a good Jew. I don't need lectures, not from Donald Trump or anyone else. I'm allowed to be critical of Israeli policy because I love Israel. You know, there's an element where, you know, if I go drinking with my friends, right, I don't let my friends drive drunk. That doesn't make me not their friend. That makes me their friend not to let them drive drunk. Right. So if I think that Israeli policies are endangering Israeli survival, which is what I do in certain respects, or corroding that country, it's my job as a Jew to say that you're only a good Jew if you support everything Israel does, to me is an idiotic position to take. So the fact that evangelicals do that because it's God commanded up to a certain point of Armageddon, that, you know, I'm not here to tell evangelicals what they should believe. God bless. They can believe whatever they want to believe when it comes to that. But the idea that I have to trash Jews who are critical of aspects of Israel because of their values or their beliefs, and therefore consider them not to be good Jews, that's just ridiculous to me. I completely reject that kind of a position.
I agree. I want to move into Russia because Biden just had the democracy summit. Obviously, Russia, China, Turkey, and Hungary were left out. Why do you think Biden would do this? You just stated this early on in the interview. We need to work with China on coronavirus, climate change, Iran. Same thing with Russia. Coronavirus, climate change, the Iran deal, Middle East issues with Russia too, along with China. And then Turkey and Hungary are NATO allies. I don't understand why he left them out of the summit. Is that like a dig, or why did he do that?
Yeah, definitely a dig. I look, to me, it's not about leaving him out. To me, the whole summit is an idiotic idea. I don't even understand. It's like you're bragging, right? It's kind of like your victory thing. Like, hey, man, look at us. We're the greatest democracies in the world. You should aspire to be like us. And nope, you're not invited. It's like the cool kids in high school kind of thing. You know, to me, it's so stupid. If you look at U.S. history, the U.S. is a very specific democracy. You can love it. You can be proud of it. It has a very specific history. We have all kinds of little warts in our democracy when it comes to electoral college, when it comes to the Senate, when you have, you know, the two Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska among themselves have 10 senators, you know, with a few million people, and you have California with 40 million people with two senators, right? So to me, there's a reason for that. It's the federal system. I get it. They looked at the Swiss system, copied it. But you can't look at our politicized tribal structure with a two-party system that's clearly not working anymore, where the two sides hate each other, where if I'm I can't have Thanksgiving anymore with someone that I disagree with, because you can't disagree anymore. The person has to be a bad person, right? Yeah. That's what our countries come to, that we want death. We wish death on the ones that disagree with us. That if you come to that and you're still bragging about your democratic system, I don't think that's a smart idea. First of all, you know, when you're talking about China and Russia, like Turkey, like you rightly said, Turkey and NATO, and China, Russia, obviously superpowers, nuclear powers. You talk about Iran. How are you going to deal with Iran without China and even Russia through the back door, right? And I can tell you another thing. There are situations of American hostages that get kidnapped in countries where the ones who actually help us, I can tell you that from my own experience recently, the ones who actually help are China's intelligence services. Why? Because the US has already sanctioned everybody. There's nothing for the US to do anymore. So let's stop all that stupid grandstanding. This kind of a summit is done entirely for domestic consumption. That's about the next election, where Biden can say, man, I'm a world player. It's nothing to do with my personal beliefs of whether I like Joe Biden or not. All I'm saying is there's nothing whatsoever to be gained by these kind of stupid summits. So my answer is not we should invite China and Russia. My answer is we shouldn't do the summit any which way. Now, on that question, I do think there are moments to embrace China and Russia, right? Embrace, not, you don't have to agree with everything someone does, but you should embrace. Let me give you a little anecdote. When Vladimir Putin came to power, right, in the early 2000s, there was a big debate of NATO expansion. And at the time, Madeleine Albright in the Clinton administration was the one pushing for NATO expansion, and it was Clinton and Sandy Berger, national security advisor. And everyone was so proud. We won the Cold War. We're going to kick their butts. We're going to expand the NATO to Russian borders, and we're going to get rid of all the Warsaw Pact countries, and all of them, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, broken up Yugoslavia, they're all going to be part of NATO, and we're going to show Russia who won the Cold War, right? How did that work out? Imagine a different scenario. Now, I'm going to tell you something. There was a meeting between Putin, Sandy Berger, Madeleine Albright, and Bill Clinton. I know that for fact. For a fact, because one of the people who was there told me the story. Okay. Putin says, listen, we just can't have NATO expansion to our borders. We're going to treat it, because if you're expanding NATO and you even have German troops at our border, it can't be that after the Second World War, German troops are again standing at Russian borders. We're not going to accept that. And everyone's kind of looking around, well, you guys kind of lost the Cold War. Then Putin says something consequential. Remember, this is Putin early on, very different person from the person today. And Putin looks at Clinton and says, you know what we can do? You need to expand it, then why don't you admit Russia into NATO? Everyone's looking at their shoes, looking at the drapes, looking out the window. It never really happens. Just imagine the different world we're in today. If instead of shoving Russia's face in it, because doing a victory dance and saying, you guys lost, we won, instead of that, being gracious and saying, we're going to rebuild it, we're going to embrace you. Russia, we're bringing it into our fold. You're now part of NATO. Imagine the different world we're in today. You don't have a Ukraine discussion. You don't have, it's a completely different Russia, completely different world. Now, can I tell you I know exactly what would have happened? No, that's the fallacy of the predetermined outcome. I can't tell you how it all would have played out, but I can tell you it would be very different from the situation we find ourselves in today. So think about embracing a group, right? Because you asked earlier, should we invite Russia and China to the summit? Not necessarily, because we shouldn't have the summit, but in other contexts, absolutely.
Well, wouldn't you say it's the same thing with the WTO and the Clinton administration letting them go into that? There would be less, there would be more jobs here, that's for sure.
And who do you think, who are you helping in trade wars, right? Even trade war with China, who do you think is paying that price? The US consumer, because every product just got more expensive. Yep. So congratulations. Yeah, I mean, trade wars are so stupid. And if you have an issue, let's say with another country, which China used to, doesn't do anymore, artificially devalue its currency to support its own exports, for example. Yeah, there are measures to deal with that, to adjust it, but it's not with trade wars and not with tariffs. There are other measures to deal with that. So we haven't had intelligent trade policy. Same with NAFTA. We haven't had that. They don't protect the American worker. They don't protect the foreign worker. That's not the way to have. But if you want to influence other countries for whatever reason, you don't do it with sanctions. You don't do it with trade wars. Because once you've done sanctions, and it's like a threat. Once you've issued your threat, what do you got left? Right. There's nothing. You have no leverage left. What are you going to do to someone?
So, since we're talking about Russia, how likely do you think that there's going to be that invasion
in the Ukraine?
Yeah,
I think it's going to be very likely in eastern Ukraine. Wow. Yeah, look at you. You have to put the Ukraine in a different context. Understanding the Ukraine. Look, here's where Russia and the Ukraine are. Russian leaders and Ukrainian leaders don't distinguish between their countries ethnically, culturally. They view themselves as the same origin. And you have 130 million Russians who look at the Ukraine. If they see in the Ukraine a successful democratic revolution, like they thought they were getting in the so-called Orange Revolution, right, with Yushchenko and Yanukovych and all that, right? if they see that happening in the Ukraine, they're going to look at their own leaders and say, they're like us. How come we can't have that, right? So the Russian leadership will never allow the Ukraine to thrive in that kind of environment. That's different from Poland. That's different from Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, you name it. It's different entirely. The Russians will never allow for that to happen in Ukraine. Now, they're not going to go and just capture the whole country. They're not going to go to Kiev, for example, right? They're going to do that in a way that doesn't provoke a NATO military counter-reaction. And the Russians are very clever about knowing how far they can push the envelope without having a military counter-reaction. And a lot of the Russian leaders today have origins in the Ukraine. In Crimea in particular, in Odessa and other places, right? So don't forget, these are a lot of people who grew up in Soviet days. Russian leaders in their late 60s and 70s today, they were adults in the Cold War. Many of them born in the Ukraine. I write about one of those people in my last book, Nothing But a Circus. There's a story called Chesala Rus in there, where I talk about a guy who was basically a Russian sleeper agent who was born in the Ukraine. So we have to understand that the Russians are not going to allow for the Ukraine to just be embraced by Western Europe and become a democratic model of Western Europe type, right? And allow for that to happen, because they're going to create such resistance in Russia itself by Russians who look at it and say, we want that. So that's why I think it's very likely.
So then what happens with the Biden administration if, like you said, if they do, if Russia does go into Ukraine?
Yeah, nothing's going to happen. Like always, there are going to be more sanctions and they're going to be, the usual stuff, but there's not going to be a NATO counteraction. Listen, that playbook, go back to Georgia. Remember Georgia at the time, the president Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, was provoking Russia, made fun of Putin, called him Lily Putin, was giving him all kinds of crap, right? Until Russia said, we've had enough. They invade. And Georgia was sure that in the Bush administration, that Cheney and the others are going to protect him and put NATO troops available. No, didn't happen. Just a few sanctions, against a few Russians, put a few oligarchs under, freeze a few accounts. That's what's going to happen to Ukraine too. A whole lot of talks, some UN resolutions, which of course Russia is going to veto. So the Security Council is totally useless. The United Nations is useless because Russia and China and the US and England and France are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so they can veto any resolution you want to veto. So there will not be real consequences. One tool that there is against Russia, which would kind of sting, is to force European countries not to import gas via the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That would sting the Russians. It wouldn't be devastating. They could sleep at night. But that would sting them, because that pipeline, which German politicians were very much part of creating, especially the former Social Democratic Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who was on the board of Nord Stream 2. A lot of German politicians were corrupted by Russian money to join the boards of those pipelines. But if the US really wanted to show some teeth, more than any other sanctions, it's really blocking that pipeline from being properly activated. That's the best countermeasure that they have.
Lastly, on China, obviously Biden put the sanctions for the Uyghurs. There's the Taiwan situation, the tariffs, the diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, and there's other issues in general with COVID, and you went through all the Middle East issues, whether it's Iran or other issues. What is the relationship going to be with China in the Biden administration? Because it seems like China's made the Biden administration look like fools right now.
Well, I think that Biden initially correctly said that the most consequential foreign policy relationship would be China, but then the conclusions that he drew from that, he and the administration, were the wrong ones. They're treating China the way the US treated the Soviet Union in the Cold War, right? As this antagonistic other power that you can isolate. But there's one big difference to the Cold War. Cold War existed in a non-globalized economy, right? You didn't have supply chains coming from the Soviet Union. You could bleed the Soviet Union economically to the point where they had to throw up their arms and say, we can't do this anymore. We just can't keep up. We can't keep up arming our military. We're bankrupt. And they collapsed. They collapsed internally. Why? Because it was isolation. We live in a globalized economy. Everything that you like your iPhone? Well, it's being done in China. Everything that is being supplied, China has a monopoly on rare earths, right? China has secured cobalt and lithium and so on and so on. Everything that we need for electric cars. 5G technology, China is absolutely leading. You don't have irrigation in the Midwest without 5G technology and players like Huawei and so on. So we have intertwined economies and intertwined global cultures today. So you can't go at China with some protest about what's happening in the Uyghurs. I'm not saying that what's happening to the Uyghurs is not tragic, but you have to start to make some choices here. You have an intertwined global community. China is by far the most important other partner to that. If you're going to keep on antagonizing it, you're hurting your own national interests, your own citizens. So to me, you have to stop these grandstandings. And now, don't even get me started on Taiwan. That's become such a stupid discussion, such a hypocritical discussion. We don't really officially recognize Taiwan, but we're willing to send them billions of dollars worth of weapons. Just stop, okay? Just stop this. Look at the history of Taiwan. Taiwan's obviously part of China. If you think that China is being aggressive towards Taiwan, that's fine. But how are you going to engage with China? You're going to engage with China if you have a productive dialogue. If you say, hey, man, let's solve North Korea together. You know what?
Right.
China doesn't want North Korea any more than we want North Korea to go down the tubes. North Korea collapses. You have 28 million starved North Koreans traveling into China. You think the Chinese want that? You think they want a nuclear war at their borders with North Korea? No, they have a common interest with us. Let's sit down and discuss it. Let's have an intelligent China policy. Let's really have a one country, two systems policy with Taiwan, just like it was supposed to be with Hong Kong. Let's start doing that rather than the stupid grandstanding about Taiwan. This is such a dumb approach to it. And it's risking a military escalation over what? We're gonna send our entire Pacific fleet to Taiwan. We're gonna fight that war with China over Taiwan. That's really a U.S. national interest? Come on.
But there's no smart policies in any of these people running for president, whether it's in 2024 or even in 2020. It was all about tariffs rather and beating up on China.
That's because our politics have become domestic politics. And when you hear so-called foreign policy experts talk about foreign policy, it's not because it's about foreign policy. It's about the next local election, because someone is always running for some election. So if someone says, I'm tough on China, on tariffs, on trade, that's because they're a Midwestern politician, Democrat or Republican, and they need to tell the auto workers in the Midwest or the steel workers in Pittsburgh, hey, man, I'm protecting you. No, you're not. You're not protecting them. That you're actually not protecting them, right? But that's a tough. So rather than have a nuanced one, it's very easy for Marco Rubio in your state in Florida to say, I hate China and I'm going to be tough on China. Well, that's because you're running for your next election. You haven't addressed any of the issues that we really worry about. What happens when China surpasses us in weaponized artificial intelligence? What actually happens then? Have you thought about that? You're still just going to campaign with China bashing? Or let's sit down. Yeah. There are interests. It's not like I'm a panda hugger, to use that word. There are areas where our interests and China's clash. Absolutely, they clash. Let's identify them, but let's talk about the areas where they don't clash.
We just had the issue with the semiconductors, and they put a little bit of money into it. They passed that bill, but they didn't put as much money as they even need. It's not even close.
Right.
And, that's another China issue.
Right. And if you want to keep China out of 5G technology, hey, maybe we support our own 5G development. There's no U.S. company that's even close to leading in 5G technology compared to Huawei, as an example, right? So there's just a lot of stupidity when it comes into that. The issue is not that you don't have smart people in the U.S. The problem is that the smart people in foreign policy are not in politics. That's the problem.